Yeah, good morning, everybody. I'm really delighted to be invited here and to present some of my recent ideas. But I also want to take the opportunity, I think, on behalf of all the participants and the speakers, to thank the organizers, Federica, Georg, and others who are in the background for this fantastic event. And actually, everything went so smoothly, so we didn't realize the problems in the back. Always there are problems, I know from myself or from other events. And actually, this kind of event feels like as if there had no pandemic been, right? I mean, it's like before. So fantastic and wonderful. Secondly, I want just to talk a little bit about the project in the background. So right now I'm working on a book which is defending the epistemic authority of experts. That might be the provisional title of it. And there are arguments, you will see one of them here today in defense of the preemption view. We have heard a lot of criticism so far, so let's see what I can do in favor of preemptionism. And there will be I address 10 problems of epistemic preemptive authority there, and this is one of them. But let me say a little bit philosophical, or do a little bit philosophy before I start really the talk. Namely focusing on the question, what is epistemic authority? We have touched that issue yesterday, and there are different accounts around. Some people think it's synonymous with being an expert. I mean, Christoph has suggested Socratic authority. And the point I want to make, and I think Kate yesterday made a good point, doesn't really depend on what the right conceptual analysis of the term is, because it is, in some sense, a technical term. You want to cover interesting differences in reality. And I think we have a lot of concepts for things like being a superior. Experts are superiors of sorts. And I mean, maybe this comes later with Christoph, but I think Christoph has something in mind which is close to being a teacher, a good teacher. This is covered, right? So I reserve the term authority for this preemptive characteristic. And I think there's also to be said something for that is not just a decision to be made to reserve this term for that phenomenon. And we haven't talked about that. I mean, there is the issue of practical authority, of roles, of social roles, but there's also the so-called authority of moral reasons. I mean, for example, Mackie was talking about that, or Richard Joyce and others. And what is characteristic? It's the binding force, and many people think also that moral reasons are such that you cannot weigh in prudential reasons against them. So if there's a moral reasons, all moral things considered, then you should do that no matter whether you have really strong interest in killing or betraying someone, right? This is just all excluded. And that has also some kind of preemptive characteristic. So you might say there is a little bit of halfway conceptual analysis which suggests that when you want to pick out this kind of characteristic of authority, then using it to characterize preemptionism with that label has good reasons for it. Okay, so that was just one remark before I start. So we are all always in situations where we have to make our decisions. And we ask the question, what shall we do? Shall we go to the theater or to the movie? Shall we go to that restaurant or this restaurant? Shall we buy this car or that car? Or how shall we go on with life? Shall we become a philosopher, or let's say a medical doctor, earning a lot of money, or going more for our interests? Politicians make decisions. I don't want to list them, but you know all these situations. So how is this to be done? There are two options, I think, in general. You might say, yeah, you have experts and they give you advice and you just defer to them, or you decide autonomously. If you go for the situation or the option just to defer to the recommendations of the experts, I will show you in a minute that there are really severe problems with that. But you might still think, if you have expert authorities, they need not dictate the final outcome, but they might dictate or give you preemptive reasons for some of the premises you use in practical deliberation. So that would be a partial use of preemptive authorities within practical deliberation. And there's also a problem with that. So there seems to be a strong conflict here. And this is the initial worry. And let me just give you a little bit more on that. So you might ask, why can't deliberately lay people, including politicians and experts from other fields, right? They are also lay. I mean, a biologist is a lay person with respect to philosophy, and a philosopher is a lay person with respect to physics, and so on and so forth. So we are all, in most of the domains, even if we are experts in one domain, are lay people all over. So why can't they treat experts as epistemic authorities? One problem is experts are specialists, and specialists cannot make the whole deliberation, which has to take into account all relevant reasons. So all things considered, we have to do that and that, but the specialists only address some of the reasons, so they are not apt to take over, to make the decision in our place. That's the one problem. So you might say relevant evidence remains unconsidered by them. But also when you consider the other option, namely that you get authoritative input and then start deliberating about that, there's a problem with rational integration of that information. Why? Yeah, if we do this kind of deliberation, we use premises, but premises are often built upon defeasible reasoning. And when we apply those premises to problems, then we have to reconsider the reasons in the background. But if the authority is a preemptive authority, this is blocked, right? We can't do that. So it's not suitable for what I call critical thinking. And this is a worry. You can imagine if I'm a defender of preemptionism, I have to say something about it, and I will. But I want to explore how far, to what extent, in what respects the worry is valid. So here is the plan for this morning, for my session. So I start with giving you a motivation for epistemic authority in this preemptionist sense, which is distinct from Rass's and Saksepski's argument, and I think it's better, but let's see. It uses a little bit of what Rass has suggested, but it makes, hopefully, progress. Then I want to address practical deliberation and expert advice and how they interact with concrete examples. And then I want to present you a kind of dilemma, which resonates somehow what I already said, but in more technical, in the clearer form. And then I will present a solution to that dilemma. So let's start. So you might ask, what weight has expert testimony? And here's Jennifer Lackey. She has a total evidence view on that. She's not a defender of preemptionism, but she argues like follows. So she relies on evidentialism. You should proportion your doxastic attitude to the total body of relevant evidence that's available to you. And then she adds that testimony is evidence. I think that's pretty uncontroversial, at least today. And thirdly, experts are testifiers that are highly reliable and epistemically superior to lay people in their domain. And therefore, recognized expert testimony should have a strong evidential weight when lay people adjust their doxastic attitudes. I think that explains a lot of cases, right, when we defer in the end to the expert because the weight of their testimony is stronger than our own reasoning. We do this, we appreciate our own reasons, but we know that we are not as good as they are. So on balance, weighing all this, we go with the experts in many cases, not in all cases. So, but then there is the alternative view. Probably you know Linda, you know also Joseph Rass, who recently died, I think only a few days ago. And here it seems that they want to say, I use here the term expert testimony. And most of you know that Saksepski is not talking about testimony, but about beliefs. But I don't want to quibble about these kind of differences. I want to focus on testimony here. So this is in some sense rough. So what is the basic claim here is that expert testimony requires lay people to disrespect, to not being responsive to relevant further evidence. And Arnon Karen and others have also defended that view, I myself included. So here's the argument, and that probably is one important thing here. So let's start with the idea that experts, and I'll say a little bit about it in a second, experts are highly reliable and superior reasoners, to lay people in their domain. I think that's uncontroversial. That's also in line with what Grundmann and others have said. And they have considered all the relevant domain-specific evidence available to lay people. What is domain-specific evidence? We can focus more strictly later on, but the basic idea is, for example, if you have an expert physician, I mean, it's propositions about physics, and these kind of propositions are the input for reasoning. Right? That's the domain-specific reasoning, and the domain-specific reasons, and there's other reasons, of course, reasons about who said what is in the papers, what psychological factors were relevant for the judgment, for example, biases or all kinds of ideologies and so, and other stuff. We'll see, come to that. I think that very label has not been well discussed, and it's very important to make distinctions which are missing, for example, in Linda Sachsebsky's position. So here a little bit about experts. Why do I say that? So there's Goldman's veritism, and even roughly again, according to Grundmann, a cognizer is more reliable than average people and is sufficiently reliable, crosses a certain threshold. What's wrong about it? I think Michel has presented a good counter-argument, namely, if you are someone who has a very nice friend who herself is an expert, always giving you the right results, then your cognition will be reliable and sufficiently reliable, but you wouldn't call this guy expert, right? The friend is an expert, but not the one who relies on the testimony. I think you had a case close to that. So here's an improved definition I suggest. So a cognizer is someone, and here I go along with Grundmann, who's more reliable than average and sufficiently reliable when relying on domain-specific evidence and has considered all the relevant domain-specific evidence available to lay people. So this definition has crucially an evidential element, which is, from my perspective, missing in Grundmann and many other conceptions. And of course it solves the problem, because this guy relies on the other guy. He's just taking input from testimonial evidence, right? And that's not domain-specific evidence when we are talking about physics, philosophy, or biology, right? It's just testimony. So secondly, I think double counting of evidence is irrational. What do I mean with double counting? And this is the Rasian element. I mean, of course, you can double count evidence. I mean, doing things twice, calculating twice is better than doing it once. What I mean here is you have evidence and more evidence, and taking it together, aggregating, makes you raising, for example, the confidence or lowering the confidence. So it has effects on your propositional attitudes. And if it does, that is, from my perspective, irrational. And then when you put this together, it's clear that aggregating expert testimony with domain-specific evidence, when lay people do this, they do this double counting, right? Because they use their own evidence, and indirectly they use it twice, right? Because the expert has already made a judgment based on the very same evidence. Very often this is hidden to us, but it's still there, and this makes for irrationality. And on a closer version of the argument, I don't want to bother you with that, this results in a higher order undercutting defeater from my perspective, and this is completely rational than to not using the evidence, where you have higher order reasons that using it would lead to irrationality. I think that's a well-investigated phenomenon, and it's no longer miraculous, right? And this is one key element in preemption. But I think what we only get from that is that lay people should disrespect either the domain-specific evidence or the expert testimony. I think Christoph has made a lot of that. It's not clear what has to go, right? Sometimes you said we can rely on our own evidence, but we should not, as lay people, aggregate both. So here I need an additional premise to say why we should go with the expert. And the idea is that it's more likely that lay people will be rational when they respect expert testimony than respecting their own domain-specific evidence. I mean, the experts are well trained in their field, they are very good reasoners, so it's more likely that when you have to choose and take one of them, that you have to choose a better way going just with the rational consideration of the expert. And from that, you get something like qualified preemption. So what I mean by that is when lay people are exposed to expert testimony, they should disrespect their domain-specific evidence. That does not mean that they should disrespect any further evidence, just the domain-specific one. So this is not total evidence or replacement, because replacement said any further evidence has to be ignored. And I think from there we get by defeasance reasoning to the conclusion that lay people should defer to expert testimony. What do I mean by defeasance reasoning? Yeah, we make this reasoning unless there is no relevant domain-independent evidence available. So we do not use the domain-specific evidence, but there might be further evidence which might be relevant not to defer to the expert. But if that's absent, we get full preemption. And many of the objections to preemption just are based on not recognizing this step, right? They say, yeah, what do you do if there are conflicting experts, or what do you do if the expert is biased, and what else? And this is all further evidence you can get, which would defeat this further step, and then there's no deference. But often it's just absent. You have no information about that, and then you can make this further step. Okay, and what is domain-independent relevant evidence? I mean, there's also, of course you can do physics and say there's further evidence in logic, and so this is not what I mean. But what might be defeaters here that can defeat this defeasible reasoning? This includes social evidence, so knowledge of judgment of further experts, of further lay people's judgment. For example, if you have one expert and you do mental math and 100,000 lay people and they all agree, then by the Condorcet theorem you very easily can say you have to refer to the lay people, right? But you have to have knowledge about all these judgments. You have to be knowledge that there's a certain independence, that there's a minimal initial reliability of all the lay people, and this is often not satisfied, or you just miss information about that. You lack information, and so you can't do that. Another point is psychological evidence, so about truth unrelated interests. I mean, bias, of course, deceit and betrayal, but there's also evidence from other domains which is more directly connected to the content. For example, there's a biologist making all kinds of stuff. We understand the sentences, but we do not a lot of biology, but still we can follow and see, oh, here's a fallacy, right? As a logician, as a philosopher, we can detect that, and we can use it, because here we probably have better skills than the biologists, so this is not ruled out. So you can see there's a lot of resources to still defeat deference to the expert, and I think it is still compatible with the basic preemptional view I want to defend here. Okay, but now let's switch to the second part. So here's one easy picture, or simple picture of practical deliberation. And of course, it's addressed to the lockdown and to epistemologists, to epidemiologists and so on, because it should be somehow related to current issues. So someone says, I mean, maybe a leading epidemiologist, a countrywide lockdown for 6 weeks is the most effective means to reduce the mortality rate. Secondly, the mortality rate should be reduced, and therefore, normative conclusion, a countrywide lockdown should be imposed for 6 weeks. I hope the alarm clocks go on with you. This is very bad reasoning. Why? Because the should supervenes on all things considered, and here are not all things considered. So a better or more appropriate reasoning should look like the following one. I think it's not complete. There can be further amendments and supplements, but I think this is at least more realistic. So you have the efficiency claim. The first premise is the same as before. Then you have also the premise that a countrywide lockdown for 6 weeks has such and such side effects on economy, social facts, psychological facts, cultural, educational things, so pupils cannot go to school, and so on and so forth. To reduce the mortality rate is a good thing, and the side effects are bad, and now doing such and such is the best choice, all things considered. So, normative conclusion, you should do such and such. I do not, this is just a variable, because I do not want to argue now what was the best way. I mean, we can do this in the Q&A, but I don't want to defend any position here. But it's a complicated weighing, and so that should be more appropriate as a picture of practical deliberation. So what could the expert do? I mean, just the bare logical options here. So it's nothing what I want to defend. So one way would be to say, yeah, the expert gives a normative recommendation, what you should do, all things considered. So she would say, such and such should be done. So what's here written under 6. Or she could give authoritative input to the reasoning. For example, the epidemiologist would say something like the first premise, or experts from other domain would say something like the second premise, and ethicists might defend the third one, and the fourth one might also depend on ethical expertise, but also on knowledge of preferences. So you can see it's a complicated issue, and in what follows, I will go through these options, not through all of them, but just discussing the normative recommendation issue and recommendations of any of the premises. So, there's a choice. The expert could, I mean, in principle, either deliberate in the agent's place and give a normative recommendation, or the expert provides the agent with informational input that is relevant, but in itself does not determine the conclusion of one's own deliberation. So now we come to the dilemma. It's the same as I just said before, but now I plug in preemption, because I want to try out that. So the expert either gives a ready-made preemptive normative recommendation to the layperson, or she provides the layperson with preemptive information that the latter will use as a premise of her own reasoning. These are the options. So the former case, so the case where the expert gives this preemptive normative recommendation, there's information relevant to the normative recommendation from other domains, from ethics, from preferences, and so on and so forth, that can't be used to defeat this recommendation. There is this relevant information because experts are always specialists, so they only focus on a subset of the relevant evidence, and it can't be used because the recommendation is supposed to be preemptive, right? So that's a problem. But here's the other one. In the later case, when preemptive information is supplied as an input, as a premise to the reasoning, the deliberating agent must adopt the preemptive verdicts of experts when she uses them as premises of her practical reasoning, and thereby her reasoning becomes insensitive to defeaters and ignorant of further relevant domain-specific evidence. I will go into that a little bit more and what comes next. So you might say at this point, okay, then, I mean, there's no healing inside you, no solution to this dilemma. I mean, either way, if you use preemptionist experts for practical deliberation, this will end in disaster, for one of the reasons I suggested. So let me be a little bit more accurate about the two horns of the dilemma. So in the paper written version I sent to Georg, there's this description of a case, but I wanted to make it more vivid, so I use a little pictures to give you an impression. But there's also an accurate version of it, but I think talking around is better than just reading stuff. So there's Irene, she has terminal uterine cancer, and she goes to the doctor, and there are two options. So she can have a longer lifespan if she goes to the hospital, because there's, massive medical treatment, and let's say this would make her lifespan longer. The alternative is she has a shorter lifespan if she goes back to home, lives with her loved ones, but within family, within a familiar surrounding and so on. What should she do? I think the specialist, here the medical specialist, is of no help, right? Because what's really important are her preferences. And there might be different preferences, and given these different preferences, different choices are the right ones. So one preference might be that Irene is really in lack of time. She wants to finish her book, her recent book on epistemic authority, and the clock is ticking, so she needs time, and even if she spends the time in hospital, she will live a little bit longer, and she hopefully can finish her book. On the other hand, if Irene is not searching or trying to finish a book, but just want to be surrounded by the loved ones and interact with them socially, then she might say, even if I'm not living that long, I have a better life quality staying at home, so that makes a difference. So what you can see here is the expert, medical expert, and I think everybody's aware of that, but I just make it explicit here, cannot give you a normative recommendation because part of the relevant evidence is the preferences. And of course, the expert can ask for the preferences, but she will not be an expert with respect to the preferences, right? Because the real expert is the person himself. I know that we are not always the best to find out what our best is in our best interest, but at least it should be informed by those who are involved. And so you can see this is really a problem for the idea that there is an expert specialist who will give you a normative recommendation preemptively. So here's Elia Milgram, who has written a very interesting book. I don't know whether some of you have read it, on the Great Endarkment. So he thinks the tyranny and bad development of current philosophy, but also in general, is hyper-specialization. There are all these specialists, and they are not able to have this kind of holistic reasoning which involves all relevant reasons. And since this is, timely, because we get more and more specialized, he thinks, especially in analytic philosophy, that's a very, very bad movement, because we lose skills here. And especially he is focusing on the problem of cross-disciplinary defeasibility management. So the idea is, even authorities, they have not always proofs, but in their reasoning there are hedges, there's defeasible reasoning, and they come to conclusions. And when those specialists give advice to others, of course, they cannot communicate all the hedges and the defeasibility because it's complicated, right? So if they just give the verdicts, then these kind of qualifications are left out, and that spoils for the deliberating agent, doing it good, right? Because it's sometimes misleading if we have general verdicts, which under certain conditions do not hold, but the person who receives the information is not aware of that. Okay, and this is a picture, a schematic picture. I don't know whether it's really helpful. I tried my best. So this is, in a way, this kind of preemptive verdict, and the layperson just draws consequences from that. And here you can see, okay, the expert gives this verdict, but if preemptionism is not right, then the layperson can still defeat reasons in the back and then readjust and rethink the whole thing. And that might be a better way, but it's not compatible with preemptionism, because preemptionism relies on these kind of preemptive verdicts, so that such that the layperson cannot rethink in the line of new reasons the whole matter. That's the core of preemptionism. So here is now a case. I want to read it actually, because otherwise probably people cannot really follow. So it's a modified case of terminal cancer. So suppose that Irene, as before, a physician has told her that without invasive treatment, she can continue her normal life for a while. Given this information, Irene anticipates how she will live a relatively happy and undisturbed life with her family when she decides this way. She does not realize, however, that without invasive treatment, the cancer will grow constantly, causing pain. And when things get worse, she might also need to go to the palliative station of the hospital to receive more intense palliative treatment, and so on, and so on, and so on, so forth. Since Irene is not permitted to think about these things herself, she simply takes the expert at her word and applies it to the specific case without being sensitive to domain-specific defeaters. That is a result of preemptionism, right? So that she cannot, in a way, be flexibly responding to defeaters. And there's a further problem also related to the second horn. This is not mentioned by Milgram, but I think it's also a relevant one. Namely, that often the deliberating agent is unaware and ignorant of relevant further domain-specific evidence. So take this case. Viola, this is dedicated to Viola Priesemann in Germany, who knows where she is. So she's a very famous figure in the pandemic scientific discussion. So Viola, an expert epidemiologist, yeah, it's not correct. I mean, an expert with respect to epidemiology, let's say, claims that the most effective way of controlling the COVID-19 pandemic is to run a no-COVID strategy with an incidence below 10. That includes a countrywide general lockdown for, say, again, 6 weeks. Pedagogues worry that this strategy will have severe long-term costs for the education and welfare of children. Instead, they suggest a lockdown that is restricted to adults. Now, Viola did not calculate the epidemic consequences of this alternative strategy so far. Without having knowledge of these consequences, no pedagogue nor anyone outside the field of epidemiology can decide which strategy is preferable, all things considered, right? Because we have to know when we want to save the children, what are the effects? I mean, if they are extremely terrible, we should still maybe run for the lockdown. So neither can the pedagogues calculate these consequences because the use of domain-specific reasons is preempted. So that's, again, problematic. So now the solution, I think I should say something about that. So why does the first horn not apply? I think you can easily see that experts will never have preemptive authority over lay people concerning normative recommendations. Why? Because they are always, as we said, specialists, and specialists are not experts concerning the normative recommendation because they are not better in collecting relevant evidence outside their special domain, and they have not better skills with respect to those reasons, even if they are aware of those reasons. So for that reason, the preemptionist view does not apply here. I mean, it would be bad to take the expert recommendations as normatively binding, but preemptionism does not recommend that. It's not a consequence of preemptionism. And the second horn maybe is more interesting. So let's say practical deliberation requires cross-disciplinary reasoning. And cross-disciplinary reasoning requires being sensitive to defeaters of domain-specific arguments that crop up outside this domain, and supplying domain-specific information requested by people from other domains. And if the preemption view is correct, this cannot be achieved by the deliberating agent. However, it might be achieved through an appropriate kind of division of cognitive labor. And here we are. So I think there are two general models of division of cognitive labor, and I think only one applies to this case. The one is division of cognitive labor is just a coordinated distribution of labor. So think of the following analogy. So you produce a car or so, and there are certain firms, all over the world, and they produce parts of it, and then in the end it will be put together. So they do their jobs in isolation. I mean, that's one way to doing a division or implementing a division of labor, right? But there's another one, namely ongoing collaboration and interaction. And the paradigm case would be writing a joint cross-disciplinary paper. Here, the co-workers permanently interact with each other, and they can't supervise the application of the results by non-specialists. So there may be the expert in one domain, and another one is deriving consequences for his field or her field. And then the first one says, no, be aware of this complication here. You don't know that there are defeaters, so please do not apply it in this way, but in that way. And on demand, they can also supply further information. So imagine again the epidemiologist and the pedagogue. The pedagogue says, no, it would be better to have no lockdown for children. And then the epidemiologist says, oh, wait, I mean, if we don't do that, we have modeled it, then this will run into catastrophe, so don't do that. So they can just communicate, and still the expert in their domain might be preemptive ones. So here I'm quick with the conclusions. Expertise testimony has defeasible preemptive authority for lay people. I'm sometimes switching, assigning authority to the testimony and sometimes to the people. One should actually avoid that. So it's a little bit loose here. I hope you don't mind, but I mean, you can clarify this in the discussion. Testimony of specialized experts cannot provide lay agents with preemptive normative recommendations because they are too specialized to consider all relevant reasons. Testimony of experts can provide lay agents with preemptive information as input for their autonomous practical deliberation if the experts are engaging in ongoing collaboration. So that's what is recommended. And then, this is just tentative, there may be a team consisting of relevant experts and the agent herself, and they are ongoingly collaborating, and they might together come to a normative recommendation that has collective epistemic authority for the agent. So putting all this together, the specialists contribute this and exchange about it, then there might still in the end be a conclusion which then is binding for the agent. And this is in a way the authority of the collective, which includes the agent, over the agent's deliberation. So, thank you very much.